The air in the gilded spoon was always the same, a cool, carefully controlled mix of expensive perfume, the faint scent of old wood polish, and the crisp, clean smell of money. For the young woman moving between the tables, it was the air she breathed for 8 hours a night, 5 nights a week. It was a world away from the musty practice rooms at the conservatory. A world where the clinking of ice and crystal glasses was the only music. Her feet, tucked into sensible black shoes, ached with a familiar, dull throb. It was a rhythm she had grown used to, a beat that counted off the hours of her shift. To the people dining here, she was a ghost. A helpful, quiet ghost who appeared with a fresh bottle of water or to clear a plate with a soft, "Pardon me." They saw the crisp black uniform, the neat bun in her hair, and the polite, empty smile she had perfected. They didn't see the student underneath, the one whose backpack was stuffed with heavy books on music theory and dog-eared scores of Chopin and Liszt. They didn't know that her mind, while her hands were refilling a wine glass, was often replaying a difficult passage from a sonata, her fingers mentally tracing the keys on the cool, heavy tray she carried. This job was a means to an end, a necessary bridge between the life she had and the life she desperately wanted. Every tip she earned, every dollar she carefully saved, was a brick in that bridge. It paid for her tiny apartment, for instant noodles, and for the privilege of studying at a place where most people drove cars that cost more than her entire life savings. She was on a scholarship, but it didn't cover everything. It didn't cover the quiet desperation of knowing that one missed rent payment could send the whole dream tumbling down. Her eyes often drifted towards the corner of the grand dining room. Tucked there, as if it were just another piece of expensive furniture, was a baby grand piano. Its polished, black surface gleamed under the soft, warm lights, reflecting the flickering candles on the surrounding tables. It was almost never played. It was for decoration, a symbol of class and sophistication. But to her, it was the heart of the room. It was a silent promise, a reminder of why she was here. Sometimes, when the room was quiet enough, she could almost hear it, a faint echo of the music it was meant to make. Her fingers would twitch, her thumb pressing against her palm as if playing an imaginary chord. She would imagine the feel of the cool, ivory keys, the weight of the pedals under her foot, the way the sound would fill this silent, sterile space and bring it to life. She remembered her grandmother's old upright piano, the one with the yellowing keys and a faint musty smell. It was in that small living room filled with the scent of baking bread that she had first learned to play. Her grandmother, with her wrinkled, gentle hands, would sit beside her. "Music is a language, my dear," she used to say. "It speaks when words are not enough. Don't ever let anyone take your voice away." That promise, that memory, was the fuel that kept her going on nights when her feet felt like they would fall off and her smile felt like it might crack permanently. The customers were a different breed. They spoke in low, confident tones about things she couldn't fathom: stock market fluctuations, art auctions in Geneva, the troubles of owning a second yacht. Their laughter was different, too. It wasn't the loud, free laugh of her friends back home. It was a measured, polite sound, like shards of glass clinking together. She moved through their world like a fish out of water, observing, learning their codes and customs, but never truly belonging. She was the help, an invisible part of the scenery that made their evening possible. One night, a couple at a table near the piano was discussing a painting they had just purchased. The price they mentioned was more than it would cost for her entire 4 years of tuition. She stood by their table, waiting for them to pause so she could ask if they needed anything, and felt a strange, distant feeling. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more like a profound sense of separation. They lived on one planet, and she lived on another. The only thing that connected her to worlds was the silent, gleaming piano in the corner. It was the one thing in this room that she understood better than any of them. It was her anchor. She cleared their plates and moved on, her movements practiced and graceful. She had learned to navigate the tight spaces between tables without a sound, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to maintain an aura of calm professionalism, no matter how demanding a customer became. It was a performance, just like playing the piano. But this performance left her soul feeling empty, while the other filled it to the brim. As she dropped off the dirty dishes in the kitchen, she took a deep breath. The smell of garlic and spices, a welcome temporary relief from the perfumed air of the dining room. She looked out at the room, at the soft lights, the hushed conversations, and the beautiful silent piano. The night was still young. The tables were filling up. She straightened her uniform, pasted the polite smile back on her face, and went back out into the quiet, gilded world, ready to play her part. She had no idea that the greatest test of that performance was just about to begin. The shift in the room's atmosphere was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. It started near the entrance. A low wave of energy that made the maître d' straighten his posture and hurry forward with a smile that was a little too eager. A group of people had entered, led by a man who seemed to command the space around him without saying a word. He wasn't the tallest or the loudest, but he had a certain gravity, a way of carrying himself that made people instinctively make way. He was dressed in a suit that looked less like clothing and more like a second skin, tailored perfectly to his frame. His companions, a younger man and two women, laughed at something he said, their laughter a touch too loud, a touch too practiced. The young woman watched from her station by the kitchen, her tray held loosely in one hand. She knew the type. She had served them before. They were the ones who treated the restaurant as their personal living room and the staff as invisible furniture. Her manager caught her eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. She was on duty for the big table. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and pasted her professional, empty smile on her face. It was time to go to work. As she approached, the man was already holding court, his voice a low, confident rumble that cut through the room's gentle hum. He was talking about a recent business deal, using words like leverage and disruption and synergy. His companions nodded along, their eyes wide with admiration. He didn't look up as she arrived at the table, simply snapped his fingers twice, a sharp, dismissive sound. Water. Sparkling. And don't be slow about it, he said, not to her, but to the air around him. She felt a small, familiar flicker of annoyance, but she pushed it down. Of course, sir. Right away, she replied, her voice soft and even. She turned and walked back towards the bar, feeling his eyes on her back. It was a test. They were always little tests. The snap of the fingers, the unnecessary rudeness. It was a way of establishing dominance, of reminding her of her place. She had learned long ago that the only way to win was not to play the game. The evening continued in this vein. He sent back the first bottle of water because it wasn't cold enough. He complained that the breadsticks were soulless. He found fault with everything, not because there was anything wrong, but because he could. Each time, she responded with the same quiet efficiency. I'll be happy to bring you another, sir. My apologies for that. I'll speak to the kitchen. She was a wall of polite compliance, and his comments bounced off her without leaving a mark. Or so she told herself. Inside, her mind was racing. She thought about the mountain of theory homework waiting for her. She thought about the rent due in 2 weeks. She thought about the beautiful, silent piano in the corner. A symbol of a world where talent and hard work mattered more than how much money you had. These thoughts were her shield, her armor against the casual cruelty of the man at the table. The real trouble began when she was clearing the main course plates. The table was deep in a conversation about some expensive art they had all seen. The man was holding forth, his voice dripping with condescension. It's the problem with the world today, he said, gesturing with his wine glass. Everyone thinks they're a critic. Everyone thinks their opinion matters. People without taste, without breeding, without any real understanding of culture, pretending to know what's good. It dilutes the whole market. As she carefully lifted a heavy ceramic plate, her mind, seeking an escape, drifted back to the conservatory. She was thinking of a piece she was struggling with, a complex Bach fugue. The melody was tricky, a weaving of multiple voices that had to be perfectly balanced. Without even realizing it, she began to hum. It was a soft, almost inaudible sound, a low hum of the main theme that she was trying to work out in her head. It was a private moment, a tiny bubble of her own world in the middle of her shift, but the man heard it. His voice, suddenly sharp and loud, cut through the air like a knife. Well, what do we have here?" he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The entire table went quiet and turned to look at her. His companions leaned in, sensing that a show was about to begin. The waitress is humming. "Do you think you actually understand music?" The young woman froze, the plate still in her hands. The blood drained from her face. She could feel the eyes of other tables turning towards them, the hushed conversations dying one by one. The room, which had been a low hum of activity, was now dead silent, except for the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. The man leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention he had created. He raised his voice even more, making sure everyone could hear. "People like you are here to pour the wine and clear the plates, not to appreciate the finer things. It's insulting, really. You think you can just hum a few notes and be part of this world?" He let out a short, harsh laugh that was echoed by his companions. "Tell you what," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory gleam. "I'll give you $100 if you can even name the composer of that little tune you were humming." $100. That's probably more than you make in a night, right? A few people at the nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman looked down at her plate, not wanting to watch, but no one said anything. The young woman stood there, trapped in the spotlight of his cruelty. The plate in her hands felt incredibly heavy, a dead weight. Her face was burning with a shame so deep it felt like a physical blow. He had taken her small, private moment of escape and had twisted it into a public spectacle of her supposed ignorance. He had stripped her of her professionalism, her anonymity, and her dignity, all for a cheap laugh and to feel powerful. She was no longer a person. She was a prop in his performance. The entire restaurant was his audience, and she was the butt of his joke. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All she could do was stand there, humiliated, as the silence of the room pressed in on her from all sides. The silence in the room was a heavy, physical thing. It pressed down on her shoulders, making the plate in her hands feel like it was made of lead. Every eye was on her, 100 different expressions blending into one single piercing gaze of judgment. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, a deep, painful blush that she knew was visible to everyone. It was the blush of shame, of being exposed, of being made small. The man at the table, the one who had caused all this, leaned back with a look of pure satisfaction on his face. He had won. He had proven his point, whatever that point was. He was powerful, and she was nothing. Her first instinct, the most natural human instinct in the world, was to run, to turn around, walk quickly back to the kitchen, and disappear, to hide in the familiar chaos of clattering pots and the sharp smells of onions and garlic until the shift was over, to go home to her tiny apartment and cry into her pillow. That was the safe thing to do. That was the smart thing to do. Her job was on the line. The scholarship, the rent, the dream it, all depended on this job. A single wrong move could bring it all crashing down. She saw her manager out of the corner of her eye. He was standing by the entrance to the kitchen, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. He gave her a tiny, almost invisible shake of his head. It was a clear, desperate message. Walk away. Don't engage. Just get out of here. Apologize later if you have to, but just end this now. He was thinking about the restaurant's reputation, about the angry review the wealthy man could leave, about the trouble this would cause. He was thinking like a businessman, and in his world. She was an employee who was creating a scene. Her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. A part of her wanted to obey. To just be a good employee, to swallow the poison he had just fed her, and to keep her head down. That's what she had always done. That's how she had survived. But as she stood there, the man's cruel words echoing in her head, something else started to stir deep inside her. It was a small, quiet feeling at first, like a single spark in a dark room. It was the memory of a voice full of warmth and love. It was her grandmother's voice. From a lifetime ago, sitting on the worn bench of that old upright piano, "This music is in you, my dear," her grandmother had said, her wrinkled hand covering the young girl's small one on the keys. "It's a gift. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you live in a mansion or a small apartment, When you play, you are speaking with your soul. Never, ever let anyone make you feel ashamed of that. Never let anyone silence your voice. The memory was so vivid, so real. For a second, she could almost smell the baking bread from her grandmother's kitchen. She could almost feel the gentle weight of her grandmother's hand on hers. The shame in her eyes began to cool, hardening into something else. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a quiet, unshakable resolve. The man had tried to take her voice, to silence her, to reduce her to nothing more than a uniform and a tray. But her grandmother was right. Her voice was not just the sound she made when she spoke. It was in her hands, in her heart, in her soul. And it was the one thing he could never touch. She took a slow, deliberate breath. It was the first calm breath she had taken since he started speaking. In that breath, she made a decision. She was not going to run. She was not going to hide. She was not going to let him win. With a steady hand, she bent down and gently placed the heavy ceramic plate on the table next to her. It was a simple movement, but it felt monumental. She was putting down the weight of her servitude, the symbol of her role in this room. She was setting it aside. Then she straightened her posture. She pulled her shoulders back and lifted her chin. The polite, empty smile was gone from her face, replaced by a calm, neutral expression. She didn't look at the man who had humiliated her. She didn't look at his shocked companions. She didn't even look at her worried manager. She looked past all of them, her eyes finding a single focal point in the far corner of the room. The baby grand piano. It sat there, silent and gleaming, a beautiful, dark promise. For months, it had been a symbol of a distant dream. But now, it looked different. It looked like an answer. It looked like a sanctuary. She turned and began to walk. Her steps were not rushed or angry. They were slow, measured, and filled with a new purpose. The room watched, completely bewildered. A few people whispered to each other, their hands covering their mouths. What was she doing? Was she quitting? Was she going to get her manager? The tension in the air was so thick you could feel it. The man at the table watched her go, his triumphant smirk slowly melting away, replaced by a look of confusion. This was not part of his script. She was supposed to scurry away in shame. She was supposed to be broken. Instead, she was walking with a dignity that he had never seen in her before. She was walking away from him, not as a defeated waitress, but as a person going somewhere on her own terms. He had lost control of the room, and he didn't know how to get it back. He, the man who commanded attention with a snap of his fingers, was now just a spectator, watching the quiet young woman make a move he never could have predicted. She walked past the tables, her back straight, her path clear, heading directly for the silent piano in the corner. The walk to the corner of the room felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step was measured, every sound in the room, the scrape of a chair. A muffled cough seemed to echo in the sudden, thick silence. She was no longer a ghost. She was the center of attention, the focal point of 100 pairs of eyes. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the hot, shameful stare of being exposed. It was a cool, curious gaze of pure, unadulterated surprise. No one knew what was happening, and that included her. She was acting on pure instinct, on a deep, inner voice that was louder than any fear. As she reached the piano, she saw her manager moving towards her from the side, his face a mask of professional panic. His steps were quick and quiet, trying to get to her before she could do whatever she was about to do. He was thinking about the restaurant, the other customers, the potential disaster. He opened his mouth to speak, gently but firmly tell her to return to her duties. But he never got the words out. From a table nearby, an older man with a neatly trimmed white beard and kind, observant eyes simply raised a single hand. It wasn't a big gesture. It was quiet, almost lazy, but it held an undeniable authority. The manager stopped in his tracks, his eyes flicking from the man's hand to his face. The older man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The manager hesitated for a moment, then, as if understanding something he couldn't quite explain, he slowly backed away and retreated into the shadows. The older man was a well-known music critic, a man whose opinion could make or break a career. and in that moment, he recognized that something important was about to happen. He wasn't going to let it be stopped. The young woman didn't see any of this. Her world had shrunk to the polished wood and black and white keys in front of her. She sat down on the smooth bench, the worn fabric of her work uniform feeling rough and out of place against the elegant, gleaming wood of the piano. It was a stark contrast, the humble reality of her life, pressed up against the beauty of her dream. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were cool and smooth, familiar and comforting. For a long moment, she just sat there, her hands resting, her eyes closed. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. The man who had humiliated her was watching, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He was waiting for her to make a fool of herself, to plunk out a simple, childish tune and prove his point. Then she began to play. The first notes were not loud. They were quiet, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in the dark. But they were filled with a deep, aching sadness. It was the sound of loneliness, of working long hours when no one is watching, of feeling invisible in a room full of people. It was the sound of the shame she had felt just moments before, a raw, open wound expressed in melody. The quiet conversations in the room stopped completely. The clinking of silverware against plates ceased. A waiter froze mid-pour, a stream of wine hovering over a glass. Everyone was captured. Then the music began to change. The quiet sadness started to build, growing in volume and speed. Her fingers, which had been moving so gently, began to fly across the keys. A storm of sound filled the room, a cascade of notes that was both beautiful and fierce. It was no longer just sad. It was angry. It was the sound of frustration, of being talked down to, of being treated like you are less than human. It was a cry of defiance against the cruelty and arrogance of the world. The music swirled and leaped, a complex tapestry of emotion that was breathtaking to hear. It was technically brilliant, but it was more than that. It was alive. The man at the table sat perfectly still. The smirk had long since vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock. He had expected a joke. He had expected to be entertained by her failure. But this was something else entirely. This was a force of nature. He could feel the anger in the music, and he knew, with a dawning, uncomfortable certainty, that it was directed at him. He was no longer the powerful mogul holding court. He was the villain in her story, and the entire room was listening to her tell it. His face grew pale. He, who was so used to being in control, felt small and powerless under the weight of her sound. The music continued to evolve. The anger began to soften, transforming into something else, something powerful and strong. It was the sound of resilience, of getting up after being knocked down, of finding strength in the face of adversity. It was the sound of her grandmother's voice, of the promise she had made to never let her voice be silenced. The melody soared, filled not with bitterness, but with an unbreakable spirit. It was a declaration. It said, "You may see me as a waitress, you may try to humiliate me, but you cannot touch the part of me that is real. You cannot silence my soul." Tears began to well up in the eyes of some of the diners. They weren't just listening to a piano piece. They were feeling a story. They were feeling her struggle, her pain, and her incredible strength. The music critic sat with his eyes closed, a small, knowing smile on his face. He was witnessing not just a performance, but a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. Finally, the music reached its peak. It was a torrent of sound, a final, powerful statement that filled every corner of the room, shaking the very air. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. She played a final, resonant chord that hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. And then there was silence. A profound, deep, absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, and the spell she had woven, the echoes of the music still ringing in their ears. The young woman sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She had poured everything she had into that performance, every ounce of her pain, her anger, and her strength. And in doing so, she had not just defended herself. She had transformed the entire room. She had turned a moment of public humiliation into a masterpiece of art and defiance. The final chord of the piece seemed to hang in the air of the dining room, shimmering like a heat haze before slowly, gently fading into nothing. The silence that followed was not the quiet of before. It was not an empty or an uncomfortable silence. It was a full, heavy, sacred silence, the kind that comes after something truly profound has been witnessed. It was the sound of 100 people holding their breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might break the spell. The young woman sat at the piano, her back straight, her hands still resting on the keys, as if they were a part of her. For a moment, she was not a waitress in a tired uniform. She was the artist who had just painted a masterpiece with sound. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was not the polite, restrained applause usually heard in the Gilded Spoon. It was a single, sharp sound, full of emotion. It was like the first crack of thunder in a summer storm. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, a dam broke. The quiet was shattered by a wave of sound that was so loud and so sudden, it felt like a physical force. It was a thunderous ovation, a spontaneous explosion of admiration and awe that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old building. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with emotion. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, not of sadness, but of being moved so deeply. The man who had tried to humiliate her sat frozen in his chair, his face ashen and pale. The sound of the applause was not a celebration of him. It was a condemnation of his cruelty. Every pair of clapping hands was a vote for her, a testament to the power she had just displayed. He was no longer the center of attention. He was an afterthought, forgotten prop in a drama that spiraled far beyond his control. The young woman slowly lifted her hands from the keys and stood up from the bench. She turned to face the room. The sea of faces, all turned towards her, was overwhelming. But she did not look scared or shy. She looked calm. She looked at the people who were cheering for her, a small, grateful smile touching her lips for the first time that night. It was a real smile, not the empty, polite one she used for work. She gave a single, dignified nod to the room. It was not a bow. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet thank you that said more than words ever could. Then, she did something that surprised everyone. She didn't wait for the manager or for anyone to tell her what to do. She turned and began to walk away from the piano. She didn't walk back towards the kitchen to resume her duties. She walked down the main aisle, the same aisle she had walked down an hour ago as an invisible waitress. But this time, it was different. The crowd parted for her, their applause softening to a respectful murmur as she passed. She walked with her head held high, her posture perfect. She was no longer a ghost in their world. She was a visitor, leaving on her own terms. Her manager watched her, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked like pride. He knew he should probably stop her, tell her to clock out, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He, like everyone else, had just witnessed something that transcended rules and job descriptions. The man at the table watched her go, a look of utter defeat on his face. As she passed his table without even a glance in his direction, he flinched. He quickly reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick wad of bills, and threw them on the table. It was $1,000, a massive, ridiculous tip, but it was an empty gesture that felt more like a penance than a reward. It was the only way he knew how to respond. Clumsy attempt to buy back a piece of the dignity he had so carelessly thrown away, and in the process, lost himself. He and his companions quickly gathered their things and slipped out of the restaurant, eager to escape the heavy weight of the room's judgment as she reached the front of the restaurant. The older man with the white beard, the music critic, stepped in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her with eyes full of deep respect. That, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity, was one of the most honest things I have ever heard. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. "You have a voice," he said, pressing the card into her hand. "A very powerful one. The world deserves to hear it. Call me when you're ready." She looked down at the card, then back at his kind face. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded again, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She clutched the card in her hand like a lifeline. She didn't go out the front door. Instead, She turned and walked towards the kitchen. She pushed through the swinging doors, leaving the world of crystal glasses and soft music behind. The familiar, chaotic sounds and smells of the kitchen washed over her, but this time, they didn't feel like a refuge. They felt like a part of a life she was leaving behind. She walked past the cooks and dishwashers, who stopped what they were doing and watched her in silence. They had heard the music, too. She pushed open the heavy metal door that led to the back alley. The cool night air hit her face, a welcome, refreshing change from the stuffy, perfumed air of the restaurant. She stepped out into the quiet darkness and leaned against the brick wall. Closing her eyes and taking a deep, shuddering breath, she was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not just a waitress working to survive. She was a pianist. And tonight, in a room full of people who had tried to make her feel small, she had finally found her voice.